All right, I am Andrew McConville, and I am a second-year grad in the MFA program here at UWM. I came into the program with a professional background in UX design for web interfaces, but my MFA work has taken me off the computer screen and has me building physical interfaces instead. And so during this talk, we'll see three keyboards, the first of which is pictured here. Here's another one, this time a linear keyboard. And the third project, which is an active piece I'm currently working on. But first, a little origin story. And so I grew up in a military family and we moved a lot. And so after each move, while I was adjusting to my new environment and making new friends, I also had a lot of time to spend on the computer. However, there was a silver lining to all that culture hopping and moving around, and that was I had to consistently interact with new and diverse people, and which this is something I do now as a user experience designer. So I'm constantly seeking out new and diverse people to gather feedback on my design work. I should also mention that I graduated from here, from UWM in 2013 with a BFA in design and visual communication, along with a computer science minor. After that, I went to Madison, where I received a graduate certificate in UX, and then a UX research certificate from the Nielsen Norman Group. All designers in the room, you should go familiarize yourself with Jacob Nielsen and Don Norman. They are big names in the UX world, and their website has a ton of free UX related content. So after I graduated from UWM, I joined a tech company called AccuLynx. We make software for roofers, everything you would need to run a roofing business. And what you're seeing here are a handful of interface components. A lot of my time is spent designing and building reusable components for our design system. A lot of that work is buttons and lists and forms and tables and data visualizations. Nothing too flashy, but we do have a slide. And so when I started at AccuLynx, we were just a handful of people in a strip mall with all of our desks pushed together. But later when we got a real office, we also got a slide because that's just the kind of goofy thing tech startups do. And so this is where software is made, but this is how software is made. And this is what UX design looks like. This photo is from a reporting feature that I had worked on, and you'll notice there are no computers in this room. This is because as a UX designer, you spend a lot of your time just talking to people and gathering knowledge and being a facilitator of ideation. And of course, you will design and build prototypes and then show those to people and then get their feedback. And so it's a lot of just talking to people and meeting with people, kind of trying to solicit their feedback and figure out what their ideas are and is what you're building, what they want. And so if there's one takeaway you're going to take from this talk, it'll be show your work to somebody. You will always get unexpected feedback, even if you're just showing your work to only 3 or 4 people. But all right, so let's look at some of the work I've been doing in the MFA program. This is the toggle keyboard. It's made from 3D printed plastic and toggle switches that can be pushed up or down to trigger a. And yes, indeed, it does function. The toggle switches are all wired up to an Arduino, which is this tiny little green computer seen here. And then this plugs right into a laptop or a desktop with a USB cable. And given that we just talked about my background in UX design, yes, I did test this piece, and the feedback was that typing on it is horrible. More specifically, it's really fun for about 5 or 6 keystrokes, and then it quickly becomes a horrible experience. And so why would I make such a thing? Well, my background in UX design has had me searching for the best experience. And on the quest to find the best experience, I unfortunately have to abandon exciting, radical, and potentially risky ideas in favor of designing something that is really familiar and designing something that is expected from the user's standpoint. And so with this project, I wanted to go off in an unconventional direction and discover. What I discovered was that by using these toggle switches for computer input dramatically changes how the user physically and mentally engages with the act of writing. So this keyboard, it slows you down a lot. And these little toggle switches very quickly become uncomfortable. And in just a short amount of time, you begin to resist the urge to type. You don't want to use it. And this is really important to mention because the tools we use, keyboards, pens, hammers, software, they determine how we problem solve. So for example, if I'm writing with pen and paper, I can choose to stop writing and I can start drawing, or I can write sideways up the edge of my piece of paper. And so how we interact with our tools ultimately shapes our perception of what is possible. And this keyboard demonstrates that by slowing the user down. And so we'll jump forward about a year, and I did another keyboard. I call this one a linear keyboard, but with this project I had a longer timeline, and that gave me the opportunity to carry out a few design thinking exercises that I would typically use in my UX practice. And so we will take a look at some of those later. But my goal here was to remove or diminish the human presence somehow. But going in, I didn't know exactly how I wanted to do it. After doing the toggle keyboard, I knew I wanted to emphasize and amplify or maybe even isolate the act of typing, which is a very human-specific activity. And the keyboard itself, so prolific. You're probably sitting in front of a keyboard right now. And if not, there's probably one in your pocket on your phone. So what would it mean to disrupt the relationship that we have with the keyboard? And so those previous photos were the final version, but let's take a look at some process. And so my work typically starts with some sketches or an arranging of parts. So if I'm going to remove the person from the keyboard, how will the keyboard type by itself? And so here is a keyboard switch and a servo in that blue housing there, and they are connected by a string. And so then I need to house that in something. And so I jump into Rhino 3D to start modeling some kind of frame or enclosure. And then once that's good enough, I 3D print it. And then we get this. This is a proof of concept, but it is just a technical exercise. And how might I go about depressing a keyboard switch without actually touching it? And this could be a way. Maybe it is the way. Maybe it's not. But I had the one key working. And so it was time to scale it up to 3 keys. And this is where things get a little bit unexpected. I showed this to several people, and the feedback I got was, it's creepy, and it is uncanny in its motion. And the sound. I was not expecting the sound. And I actually spent a few weeks trying to get rid of the sounds. But let's keep going. And so this time from 3 to 6 keys. And now I'm quickly running out of room for the servos and the wiring. And the sound is also getting much louder. But by this point, I'm starting to lean into the sound. Something else unexpected is happening here. While I was gathering feedback, you'll see on each key I have a little sensor, a light sensor, and so that when the viewer's finger gets close to the key would depress itself. This, however, caused people to end up playing it like an instrument. That was unexpected, but at the same time, it was like really awesome to watch people wave their hands back and forth across this to make all the keys go up and down with their hand gestures. And so that was 6 keys. You know, really wanted to get up to 26 keys for sure. And kind of at this point, I was really trying to go with the traditional keyboard layout. And I just kind of asked myself at one point, like why? Why am I so stuck on that layout? We already know what that experience is. We've seen that before. That's how every keyboard is in that layout. And so I kind of looked at this as an opportunity. This work can take any form that it needs. And so here I'm toying with the idea of taking the traditional layout and squishing it down into just a line. And then here's a couple more. This is Illustrator coming up with some different layouts, and then some sketches by hand. And so there's this kind of conductor, like orchestral arrangement. You know, people have been playing the previous version. And so maybe this one could also be played to some extent. Also toying around with the idea of adding a screen. Maybe not. I didn't know. And so here we are. Still don't have an idea for what I want to do with the arrangement yet. But let's just see if I can control 26 motors and keys. And so previous versions, definitely described as uncanny and creepy. But for me, this is the creepiest prototype. It's the chorus of the machine uprising. I'm controlling it by the photo sensor in the back there, and this causes it to behave very similar to a theremin. It's creepy, but it's an oddly satisfying, affective sensation to control all those modules in real time via direct manipulation. As my hand moves, they respond to that movement. It's somewhat empowering, but also somewhat unsettling to control so many mechanical devices at once. But that is not the final form, so I must continue to iterate. In all my design work, art or design, I often have several small iterations within each larger prototype. And so here is me iterating on the servo and switch housing. And I want to point out that I believe it's important to get your work off the computer screen, bring it into the real world, hold it, listen to it, move it around. Physical objects, they read so much different than on-screen renderings could ever do. And I ended up here with these little modules. And you may have been noticing that in my work, I use lots of manufactured parts. And I use an aesthetic approach that portrays my work as a real device, like something that when a viewer sees it, they might wonder if they should know what it is. They might be asking themselves, have I seen this thing before? Are there thousands of these out in the world and I've just never noticed them? Are these coming off the assembly line and they're just all over the place? And I do that in part for a couple of reasons. One is it draws the viewer in. Like, they'll often inspect the object and try to map out what they're seeing. But two, I also keep the object open because I'm inspired by open source culture. And in the programming world, there's an idea that all code should be transparent and viewable by anyone. And so if you're wondering how somebody coded something, then you should be able to look at the source code and see how it works. And I love that. And that's how I learned to code. And so this is the most current version. And it's doing what we do. It's typing. And when you look at this, it presents the viewer with a sudden, unexpected confrontation of their relationship with technology. Here is an object engaging in the human activity of typing, yet there is no human present. And with this one, I got some different servos. And so the sound you're hearing here, it's very satisfying in person. It's about 70% servo, 30% switch. I have the loading bar, which is, kind of digital loading bar to show something loading, but then also carriage return of the typewriter. This one turned out pretty good. But I wanted to know what other people were thinking of this piece. And so critique is great, but critique is a learned skill. You can't just critique with anyone. And sometimes in critique, there are participants that are louder than others and some who are a lot more quiet and don't really speak at all. And so from my UX background, I know there are lots of other tools to solicit feedback. And so here I'm setting up an affinity mapping exercise. And so what we did, here's how affinity mapping works, is I had fellow grads in my studio, and they all just wrote down words. So one word per Post-it note, write down whatever you're feeling. I turned the keyboard on and let it play, and write down all your words, and then put them up on the wall. And then I came back in and grouped all those words by theme. And then, of course, what inevitably happens is people see words of others and they wish they wrote those words. So then all those little green dots we get to go back in and vote on our favorite words. So affinity mapping is great. It works with any group of people. Like, you all listening to this talk, you all can do this. You could totally do this with any of your coursework. You should try it. Very low effort. And in my practice, my UX practice, I talk to all kinds of people who know nothing about art and design, and they do not care about art and design. They just want the stuff that I make to work. And this works really well for them. And so here I kind of move this over to Illustrator so I can look at it when it's not up on the wall. But some of the themes were, of course, definitely, if you look in kind of like the upper left, there's noisy noise sound. Yeah, definitely, for sure. But then there was also a huge interest around the human body. So down on the bottom right, there's that whole cluster down there that are all related to the body. And then there's also just the word human body, which is super unexpected for me because the human body and the human is not present, which I guess would make sense here. But I just loved that that came up as a topic. On the far right, the uncanny for sure. And then emotion was there and isolation. And not only did those words appear, but those words also got votes. And so just a lot here. This is something that I often come back to and just kind of look at and stare at whenever I look at the piece, and something that I think maybe could even be used for all my work. And so what else? I did also talk to people one-on-one. For me, this thing is kind of turned almost into a self-portrait of definitely myself, but also a lot of people, right? This is kind of what we do. We type, we're searching for content, and we're creating content, and we're typing, and we're scrolling, and we're typing, and we're scrolling. This is our life now, for better or for worse. I showed it to somebody in the computer science department, and they initially thought it was a prototype I was working on for somebody for the blind. So the keyboard, traditionally an input device, but this is actually an input device that has now become an output device. And so they thought you could perhaps put your hands on it and you could figure out what the message was that way. A workplace dystopia, definitely also very true. This thing is touching on issues of labor and transparency and loss of autonomy in the workplace, how we're kind of just cogs in a wheel these days. Also sublimely hypnotizing, yes, for sure, the spectacle of the thing, the sounds, the rhythm, the motions, the noise, the lights, all of it. It's for me, it's also a lot that it's enjoyable to look at and to listen to. And then also definitely uncanny, the AI threat these days is pretty big. Although this final version, not so much for me. This one isn't as creepy as a lot of the other iterations. But again, just going back to it, showing your work to anybody, each new person is going to bring just a totally new interpretation to the work. So get out there and show your work to somebody. All right, this is the last piece. This is the project that I am currently working on. I don't really have a name for it yet. This project does focus on all those other keys, though, that aren't the alphabet. In my previous work, that was A through Z. And so there's a ton of other keys. There's the function keys, scroll lock, end, pause, insert. And a lot of them are kind of on the way out. They're not on your phone's virtual keyboard. And I mean, maybe you could even say the keyboard itself is going extinct, but I feel like there's an opportunity to do something with all those abandoned keys. And are they abandoned? And what am I doing? Am I burying them? Am I enshrining them, preserving them, archiving them? I'm not really sure yet. Or, maybe this project is closing one door but opening another. Like, does it need emoji? The modern phone keyboard, it can alternate between the alphabet and emoji. So maybe I need to welcome in the newcomers to the keyboard. I don't really know. But either way, again, as our tools are evolving, what's afforded to us will end up shaping how we think and what we think is possible and how we communicate. And so that's where this project is headed. And I wanted to take a second to show these slides as process books, because I know a lot of designers out there do process books. I enjoy documenting my work, and I love making process books. And so on this spread we're seeing, in this prototype, I was just going to do one key, which I thought would be no sweat. But it turned into this whole ordeal trying to figure out which key to choose. It turns out, for me anyways, when you take a key off the keyboard and you have it not around all the other keys on the keyboard and you're just looking at it, it's like, oh my gosh, all this meaning comes into it. You have the control key, you have the escape key, like pause, end, home, like all those keys when they're just by themselves suddenly have all this decontextualized meaning. I ended up going with the control key, but man, that's what really makes me think this can be a series. This is Fusion 360, which is 3D modeling CAD software. So I'm figuring out like, what could my enclosure be? What could it look like? How would I go about constructing it? These are some attempts at vacuum forming. All these are unsuccessful attempts, but the model that I did in Fusion, I then made a mold and used it on a vacuum former. And then here I'm just working out how I might go about constructing and assembling this thing. This is prototype 1. I reused one of the keys from my linear keyboard just to get something in there. And if you remember from the linear keyboard, it had those lights on it. Well, the light was also working in here as it was typing all by itself inside of here. And I got a lot of good feedback on the light. Somebody mentioned it looked like a candle light, and the light in here reflects off the enclosure and off the back. And so, there was this flickering that was happening. And I felt like, yeah, that kind of went with the whole like dead keys kind of vibe that I was going with here. And so then like candles, well, that made me feel like, well, maybe it could descend down the wall from the ceiling. And then if that's happening, should there be a bunch of these lining maybe like a hallway or something like that? But I knew I didn't want to just reuse those modules that I had made for the other keyboard. And so I started to think about, well, what can I house these keys inside of? And I wanted something very specific for this project. And so what we're seeing here is just a bunch of parts. And so again, talking about iterating, working in parts is small, very small parts is a great way for me to iterate on one particular portion of the project. And then once I'm feeling like that one particular area is successful, then I can move on to the next one. And so here are a couple different prototypes. Having them all, they are all a little bit different, but having them all laid out again, it's kind of making me feel like, yeah, this could totally be a series. Here is, I talked about lights. This is getting into light a little bit more. So as this project went on, I really wanted it. I didn't want just the one little flashing light. I was like, what if this whole thing can illuminate? And so I started to make little channels in here where I could take these noodle-like LEDs and kind of stuff them in. And so, I felt the flickering candle thing, yes, definitely worked out really well, but also, malfunctioning electronics flicker. And so if these keys are dead and they're dying and they're on their way out, well, maybe they could flicker and malfunction. Like, what does technology look like when it dies? And then that led me to like, well, interactivity. Maybe pressing the key could revive it and bring it back from the dead somehow. We'll see to what those are. This is all work in progress. These are all ideas. With every iteration, new ideas come. Every time I show it to somebody, yet again, new ideas. So we'll see where this goes. Oh, and then I include this slide for color. Most of my work, I haven't worked in color, or not deliberately anyways. I've just used the color of the things that I have, the components that I buy, or just a blank white or gray PLA printed plastic that I use off a 3D printer. And color, I don't know, color is scary. In my UX design practice, I use color all the time because as a designer, you write color is very, very meaningful. It's super important. And so I haven't used it a lot because I don't want to bring in too much cultural significance. But here I've started to play with, there is lots of color in the work, the copper in the wiring and that kind of greeny, yellowish color of the circuit board back there. There's also some yellow in the banding of that solenoid in the middle, that yellow tape, and then the key also has some green in it. So just contemplating ideas, maybe incorporating some of those colors too. And then here we are, the final and current state of the final slide, but the current state of the prototype with some of the wiring roughed in. And here I'm using wiring to, wire things up electronically and carry the signals and whatnot, but also to kind of present the key as maybe it's rising, or maybe it's being lowered or being extruded somehow. The act of an outstretched support structure, which puts the key on display. And it's nearly wired up, ready to be turned on, at which point, again, I'll be seeking experience or seeking feedback on what the experience is like for those who are looking at it, and hoping for some insights that I've yet to uncover. And that is where we are. Yeah, thank you, everybody. That is a wrap. Thank you for listening to my artist talk.